All right, I wanted to briefly kind of talk about how sonar works on your fish finder, how to interpret it, and hopefully kind of help you be a little bit more effective when you're trying to locate fish as to what you're seeing. So you'll notice that I have a pint glass here, and on top of that pint glass I've got a lipless crankbait. And so essentially in this example, this lipless crankbait might represent the boat, and then this pint glass kind of represents the transducer. And so what happens on a transducer, similar to a pint glass, is that your area gets larger the deeper that you go. So this is why a lot of times when you're in shallow water, unless you're right over the top of a structure or some fish or something, it's very hard to see something because you're basically looking at a 3-to-1 ratio. And what that means is, you know, for every 3 foot of water that you're in, you're basically getting a view of a 1 foot section on the transducer. So at 30 feet, you're seeing a 10-foot area. At 60 feet, you'd be seeing a 20-foot area. 45 feet, you'd be right in between there, looking at like a 15-foot area, something like that. So it's important to remember that there's that 3-to-1 ratio. And the reason that this is important, again, is it's obviously a lot easier to find something in a larger area. So if I'm in 60 foot of water and I've got that view of 20 feet beneath me, then I've got a pretty good chance of finding something, whereas if I'm only getting a 1 foot view, like I said, have to literally be on top of it. So just remember that. Just because you're in an area and you're thinking, man, there ought to be fish here, and you can see my other video on this as well. I've fished some lakes that have a lot of vegetation on the bottom, and because of just how thick the vegetation is, the fishes are swimming in and around and between the vegetation. You can't actually see them on sonar. So keep that in mind. And so I'm going to go ahead and take this away. I just wanted to kind of represent, like I said, just kind of tell you how that works and what you're seeing. So when you see something come across your graph, it's going to be basically on your right-hand side of your page. It's going to be what's happening now. And then as it scrolls to the left, it's going to be, what happened in the past. So, whatever's happening at the moment is always going to be this first thing. You can also turn something on called A-scope, and A-scope kind of gives you a good indication. So again, if you see a fish, like over here, you see a fish, that's come and gone from underneath the transducer some amount of time ago. So if you're trying to find or target this fish or this fish, you basically would have to kind of make a guesstimate of, based on your transducer location, how far back it was, and see if you can kind of target them. But the key thing that you really, I think, are honing in on here is the fact that there are fish in the area, there are bait fish in the area, that sort of stuff. So I would focus more on that and not necessarily, there's only 2 fish here or something like that, because as you're going to see here in a second, that isn't actually true. All right, so drilling down into this example a little bit more, you can see I drew the circle where basically the edges of the transducer signal would be. And what you can see in an example like this, I'm assuming in this example that our boat is stationary and that fish are suspended or moving underneath it, just for simplicity. But the example here, what you can see is I've got all sorts of fish. I've indicated on the fish finder that there's 3 fish and some bait fish, but when you actually look, there's actually all of these other fish out here, and they could be varying sizes. I know I drew them kind of different. So, some of them could be large, whatever. So it's just something to keep in mind that, again, you're getting the snapshot. You're not seeing everything. And so to me, I'm not looking necessarily to see that there's, 20 fish on the screen. I'm looking to see that there's fish or bait fish or whatever it is that I'm looking for, and then kind of figure that out. So that's the second thing is, just don't get so laser focused on what you're seeing here, because it's only a snippet of what is actually happening. All right, the next thing to talk about here is the various things that you're seeing on the fish finder and what they actually represent. So I'll just kind of move around here and show you maybe top to bottom what's on this graph and what it actually means. So the first thing you might have noticed is you have this long line, and a lot of people will see something like this and assume, oh, that's a huge fish. And in reality, what I'm actually showing here, and this is in 10 foot, is the small little fish in 10 foot of water, but I've marked an S here, and what that was to remind me of is that this is this fish that's suspended. So you've got a fish that potentially is suspended, and you're sitting on top of that, and you're not, your boat, maybe you have spot lock on, you're not moving. And so you're getting a good return on this fish, and that's basically what it is, right? Because the live time, you're basically getting the same image over and over and over and over and over again because of that fish just sitting there suspended. So when you see stuff like that, or you see big long lines like this, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily mean there's a big fish. What it means is that you have a fish that's either moving underneath the transducer, or you're suspended and they're suspended, and that's typically what you're looking at. The next thing to look at, kind of moving down here a little bit, is you see something like this. So I have all these little bait fish, and typically what happens is the bait fish swim around in schools, and so those schools tend to kind of look like these semicircles, and a lot of are balls in the water, and that kind of, like I said, you'll see different looks for that, but that's essentially what you're seeing in that picture. The next thing, I guess we'll move over here, is I have a little dot, and this little dot is actually supposed to represent this fish, and I probably didn't do a good job drawing this on here. It should probably be partially out of this ring, but the idea is that this fish is moving, and it's a large fish comparatively to the size of these other ones, but it was only in the range of the transducer for a very short period of time. The other thing to realize about this, and this goes back to geometry, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of a conical shaped signal that it sends out. So the outside edges are actually further than going to the inside. So the distance from here to the top of the boat is shorter than it is from here going back. So a lot of times you'll get some things on the periphery that look like weak returns, but it still could be big fish, it could be a bunch of other things, but you're just not getting the full picture, as I kind of mentioned earlier. And then over here too, I've got, this is this medium-sized fish here at 25 feet. And so this fish is moving, and so it moved, you basically would have started maybe somewhere over here, moved it through the graph and then left, and you get this. And a lot of the fish on there are going to look like an arch. That has to do with the air bladder that they have in the fish, and the way that the sonar hits and returns, it always looks like an arch. So that's why you see arches, pronounced arches for fish. And then the last thing here is I've got this other thing here, and this was simply to represent that, again, if this fish was a big fish, if it had moved into the radar or the sonar again, maybe quickly, its arch might actually show up, but it might show up smaller than this other guy just because of the duration that it was underneath the transducer. So again, it gives you a snapshot, it kind of gives you a picture, but it doesn't always tell you the full picture. So a lot of times you can't look at this and get too excited and say, oh, this is a big fish or anything like that. The last thing I'll say about it too is the fish finders also, because of the way sonar works, doesn't necessarily tell you what type of fish it is either. So I can't necessarily look at these. I mean, I have a good idea that these are bait fish, but I don't necessarily know what type of bait fish. It could be any type of schooling bait fish that I'm seeing that exhibit this behavior that look like this. A lot of times like bass or something like that, or even potentially striper or small, they might be kind of below or somewhere around the same depth as the bait, kind of watching them. So that's a pretty good indication. If they were slightly off the bottom in the winter, that could be fish that are suspended, or it could be, catfish or something like that might show up since they're bottom feeders, and you might catch them on there. So sometimes you just kind of got to understand the seasonality and the behavior of the fish to kind of figure out what it is. The fish finder isn't really necessarily going to tell you the full story there. Let's see, what else can I tell you? The other thing that can happen too is sometimes you'll see stacking, and again, that just means that you probably have multiple fish. You might have a small group of bass or something like that, and you might see arches, several arches, proximately just right under each other or kind of near each other. And again, that would just indicate multiple fish kind of huddled in an area. So that's really all there is to reading and kind of understanding the fish finder. And again, just to recap, just remember that a lot of times what you're looking at is for every 3 foot of depth, you're looking at a 1 foot area. remember that what's happening on the right is what's happening now, what's directly underneath the transducer. And another way to think about this would be like a Polaroid almost, like, you know, like or somebody's just sitting there taking a bunch of pictures. And so each one of these verticals is a picture. And if you look at the pictures over time, you can kind of get the, you know, understand and interpret what's happening. And like I said, it's not always accurate, because like in the case of this little blip here, if you had a large fish that kind of was just on this edge, which is the farthest distance out from the transducer, it may come back as a weak return, and it might have only partially caught it on the graph at the time that it happened. And so sometimes you know, you're not getting 100% accurate picture, but you know, you're definitely in this example seeing that there are bait fish, there are some other fish in the area. Because you're suspended and you're not, you know, or and these fish are outside of the conical area, you may not pick these guys up. So it's kind of foolish sometimes to assume, oh, I'm only seeing 2 or, you know, 2 fish or maybe 3 fish and they're small or whatever, because that may not be the case. In this case, I think I have 10 fish drawn on here. But, excuse me, the only way you would see these would be if your boat was moving, or these fish were to come through, if you were, like I said, spot locked or something and come through. And, you know, a lot of times, unless, you know, in the more active times of the year, you know, fish are going to be constantly moving. And so, you know, you want to strike while you see them and move on.